Good evening, everyone. Hello, my name is James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise. Welcome to this ThinkIn, a discussion of how can we fix the crisis in our care homes. As you may have seen, if you're a Tortoise member, and I hope you are, or a soon-to-be Tortoise member, we started this week opening a file on care homes, on social care. Ian Birrell has spent several weeks trying to understand, in fact, in many ways, several years trying to understand what's happening in our social care system, and has written the first part of that file, a piece called Old Money. And we thought that it would be really valuable tonight, given that there's a brisk trade in blame going around the social care industry, to actually take this thinking, the hour in front of us, to try and think, how do we fix what's happening in social care, given that it's been quite such a point of sadness and a source of shame, the scale of the deaths and what that's revealed about the social care system. And I should just say something about Tortoise and the thinking. As we start this one, some of our thinkings are really quite jolly and a lot of fun, but they were always intended to be an attempt to try and understand what's really happening, often when you're thinking about a very complicated problem. And they're based on my old life, really, working in newspapers. Ian also worked in newspapers a fair old while. And we used to every day have leader conference, editorial conference. And the reason that I loved and still believe in editorial conference is that when you try to work out what you think, you very quickly discover what you do and don't know. And social care, to my mind, is a perfect example of a subject where I know there's a problem, but I really don't know what I think. I don't actually really have a worked out answer to how to address that problem. And so what we'd like to do in the course of this next hour is use everyone on the call, whether you've got direct experience, whether you've got expertise because you work in the sector, whether you've got a family member who's getting some kind of social care right now. Whatever your point of view is, feed it in, because our thinking is a more open news meeting, informed by your experience, your point of view, will lead us all to a better informed opinion. To make that happen, I know we're all kind of masters of Zoom now, but just in case, hit the chat button. You can weave in your point of view in the chat. I might well pick up on it and then bring it into the conversation, or you into the conversation. Likewise, if you want to just hit the participants tab, there's a little button that says raise your hand, and again, raise your hand and I'll bring you in. It's not a formal discussion. If you've been ever worked in a newsroom, if you've ever been in an editorial conference, you'll realize it's a pretty chaotic endeavor, which sometimes, just sometimes, comes out with a better, clearer insight. So in that spirit, I'm going to start, actually, if I might, by coming to you, Ian, and if you like, just sort of giving us a chance to take a breath, and given what you've worked on and given the chance you've had to look at the sector, what you think, if you like, is your diagnosis of the problem?
I think the problem, obviously, at heart of it is money, which everyone knows. The sector has been cash starved, and I think there's this imbalance that's been going on where the NHS is seen as sacred and must be protected at all times, whereas social care is a second-class sector. So the NHS has had extra money, despite all the problems, 26 billion over the last decade, whereas social care, with heavily rising demand from both working age and elderly people, has had its money cut. Then you had austerity on top of that. So there is money at the bottom of it. But beyond that, I think it's too easy to say it's just about money. I've seen, looking at it over several years, and I have a personal interest in it myself, how the care sector is diminished in many ways by attitudes, by society's views. And what we're seeing with this pandemic is that the systemic problems within it, whereby it is cash starved, but equally, you've had a lot of players move into it who are taking pretty good money off the back of it and exploiting people and profiteering off the back of it. And they're profiteering off the back of elderly people and people with disabilities and very sick people. And the consequence of that, combined with austerity at the same time, has been a drive towards bigger places, which I think are less human, they're more institutionalized. And that's led to bigger places. And of course, when a fatal disease comes in, you have more people gathered together, and that's had disastrous consequences. So I would argue it is very tied in to the issue of the fatalities is the systemic problems. And really at root of it, if we delve down very deeply, of course it's money, of course it's political inertia. We've had 17 white papers, green papers and state reviews in 20 years, but nothing done for tribal reasons, nothing done because of the financial difficulties and political games. But at the end of it, I think, is an issue of respect and humanity and dignity. It's about the dignity of the staff that work there, who are paid a pittance for a very hard job, often antisocial hours, because it's seen as, it's mainly women, it's 83% women. It's seen as an irrelevant, unskilled job in the words of the government. So you don't need to care about it in terms of immigration. You don't need to care about the job losses. You don't need to care about the very high turnover. So it's the dignity of the staff, but that's symbolic of something far more profound, which is the lack of dignity we as a society give to people with learning disabilities and to people who are old. And I think at root of it is the fact that we've allowed this warehousing, we've allowed this profiteering, we've allowed this low pay because of the lack of respect and the lack of dignity and the lack of care in our society for people who are probably the most excluded in society, namely people with learning disabilities and people who are very old. And at the heart of it, we can give it more money, we can solve some of these problems about ownership, we can stop allowing people who have bases in tax havens to get to profit at the benefit of it, at the expense of taxpayers. But at heart of it, we need to resolve this issue about the fact that in our society, we simply don't care. We don't care enough about people who are in these homes. And I think that's really what lies at root of this issue.
And forgive me, Ian, what are we talking about? What is social care? Who gets social care?
Good question. Social care, there's a lot of talk about care homes, which is a very big part of it. It's about, I think it's 440,000 people in care homes. There's thousands of care homes across the country, predominantly privately run. And within them, it's about 75%, about 3/4 of them are elderly people. So people in the twilight of their lives, perhaps with dementia, perhaps with comorbidities, other issues as well. And the others are people who maybe have profound learning disabilities like autism, serious autism, or Down syndrome, or people who are with very profound sickness that need 24-hour care. There is also, of course, a bigger group of people like my own daughter who actually get care in a domestic environment, domiciliary care, which is another even less talked about part of this equation, which in this crisis has actually been totally abandoned by the government, had no help at all, largely from the government. And in a way, it's more at risk because you can have one carer going up to 40 people in one day. So if they were to get infected, the chance of spreading that is even worse. But that's the other side. But in terms of this discussion, I think we're going to park that and just focus on the care home sector, which is the place where you've got all these people gathered. And that's essentially old people and working age adults with issues either of disability or of very bad health.
And Ian, I mean, just before we park it, are we making a mistake in doing that? In that, if there are two parts to this, if there is social care in care homes and there's social care at home, are you worried about the extent to which social care at home is not just being neglected by the providers of services, but politically by the media too? Is there a problem there that is going unseen?
I mean, I've lost count of the number of times I've had to remind people that the issue of care isn't just old people, and it isn't just old people selling their homes and middle-class old people. It's about all sorts of old people, but it's also about working-age adults, and it's also in the home environment. I think at the very bottom of everything are the family carers who are largely exhausted, lonely, on their own. The carers' allowance is pathetic. And life is really, really hard often, and you get very little help. And what help you do get has been diminished and denuded in the last decade. But I think in terms of the discussion we're having now, we need to bear in mind that social care is much broader and much more wide-ranging and goes way beyond care homes. But in a way, this issue of the appalling fatalities within the care home sector, I hope allows us to discuss the wider issues about care, because at root, they're the same issues, I think, about respect and dignity.
Okay, and one person, actually, Catherine Reynolds in the chat, has made the important point that we need to distinguish between residential and nursing homes, which I completely appreciate. I'm going to, if I may, in a moment, just bring in Daniel Carmel-Brown, who runs Jewish Care as the Chief Executive of Jewish Care, and can tell us a little bit about what it's like actually trying to run a series of homes, in fact. But just standing back for a minute, Ian, from your piece, the thing that I came away struck by is you looked at the structure of the industry and the extent to which it's a public service on the one hand, but as you say, it's largely invested by private entities, quite a good deal of private equity, quite a good deal offshore, quite a good deal that are using debt or the real estate market to make those businesses profitable, sometimes very profitable. The question I've got is, do you think that this is, it's fine to say, look, this is an issue of dignity, but it's also an issue about, well, what do we do about that? And how do you take dignity and build it into the functioning of a sector like social care? Do you come away from all of this and think the answer is it must be nationalized? Or do you say, actually, you can continue to have private entities operating, but the regulatory framework must be much tighter? Where do you come down?
Well, I come from a perspective where I began writing about health, writing about the NHS, and seeing some really bad things going on there in terms of whistleblowers, in terms of poor patient safety. For me, a lot of my interest is in learning disabilities, and the state now accepts 1,200 people, 100 people a month with learning disabilities die needlessly within the health system. So I don't come from a perspective arguing that the health service is fantastic, state care is brilliant, and private sector is appalling. What I come from the perspective is there shouldn't be profiteering off the back of vulnerable people, and it's about care as good as it can be. That can be from the state, that can be from the private sector. And I think that we always get obsessed with America in these debates, but you look to Europe and you get a mix there. And I have no problem with private sectors. There are some very good private sector providers within healthcare. Some of the homes run by the big providers that I've been very critical of are very good. They're not all bad. It's about finding a system which works, which is properly funded, which isn't exploited, and I think which humanizes back so that people live in the midst of communities and live in homes, which is what it's really about. We all want to live in homes.
Okay, well, Ian, I'm going to come back to you. There are already a kind of slew of people who've got engaged in this, and I'd love to hear from them. So I'm going to actually, if I may, start bringing some people in. But Daniel Carmel-Brown, Daniel, will you just give us a sense of how many people live in Jewish care homes, how it operates, and just picking up on the point that Ian was making, how many of them are funded by the state, how many of them are privately funded, how it operates?
Thanks, James. So Jewish Care provides 10 care homes across London and the South East. Before the crisis, I was able to say that we had 530 residents living across those 10 care homes. That's gone down by 20% in the last few months. Not because of COVID, we have had residents die from COVID, of course, but the primary reason it's gone down so significantly is that we locked down our homes well before the government lockdown. And as a result of that, we are not admitting new residents into the homes. So the nature of the business is that people obviously die all the time in residential care homes for older people, but you need to be able to see new people come through as needs are met. So financially, of course, the impact of that is enormous. It's absolutely enormous for organisations like us. And as I was saying before, we represent the other 20% of the marketplace that's not in it for the financial gain. But I'm just going to pick up on a couple of things that Ian said. First of all, Ian talked about some providers seeing these facilities as warehouses, and I think from where we sit, we would describe them more as greenhouses. They are places in which people can live fulfilling lives, and I think that the essence of how we think about this work is that we are a values-driven organisation. Everything we do is guided by the principles by which we operate. But maybe just turning to a couple of things that have kind of come up. But first of all, the notion that this is something that's only 10 years old as a debate is not true in my view. This has been much more long-standing than that, and it would be a mistake, in my opinion, to criticise any particular government. I'd be critical of all governments for the fact that they've not dealt with a long-term systemic issue around how care, social care, is funded. You know, we are in a slightly fortunate position as a charity where only 40% of our residents are self-funders, privately paying for their own care, and the balance are paid for by the local authority, who don't pay any more than half of the actual cost of care. But as a charity, we can turn to the community and ask the community for its support. And I suppose what I would say about that is that the model going forward, in our view, has to be a partnership model. It has to recognise that the state has a role to play in funding social care, but other people have a role to play as well. The communities in which people live have a role to play. Families do have a role to play as well. James, sorry.
Dan, I just want to interrupt, because I suppose sort of going back to the original sort of starting point of this conversation, which is how do you fix the problem, right? And there clearly is a problem, right? There clearly seems to be a problem that's not just around COVID-19. I'm not just talking about the disproportionate number of deaths from COVID-19 in care homes. I'm talking about the point that Ian makes, which is a collective looking away from a sector that actually sorely needs looking into. And one of the central points seems to emerge that you've got state-funded residents where the funding appears to have been more or less flat, you know, as Ian says, you know, hundreds of millions of pounds by comparison with billions into the NHS. And then in the privately run care homes for private residents, this significant annual increase in fees that are causing real financial strain, and a change in the profile of the sector to the consolidation of these big homes that change the nature of the care that you're getting. So what is structurally wrong there, and how would you fix it?
Well, I'm not sure I agree with the notion that big facilities are not good, actually, because in our experience, the nature of the care has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. There are a lot more people who come to us directly from hospital who are with us for much less time than people used to. I used to give the analogy of my grandmother. My grandmother chose to go and live in a residential care home some 12 years ago. You don't choose to go and live in a residential care home these days. It is a place of last resort for the individual, for their family, for the children, because the care has broken down somewhere else in another environment. But for me, I think it's important to say that whilst we can be very critical and sad about the tragedy of what has happened in the last few months, it is important to shine a light on the very positive work that happens in the sector as well. You know, when I compare the number of people that have died from COVID in Jewish care versus the number of people that I believe have survived COVID, I put that down to the quality of the staff and the teams that lead these organisations. But what I would just say about the space issue is that increasingly people that live in our care homes are living with dementia or some other form of memory impairment. And in that environment, you need to have effectively households of smaller numbers of people living together. So they're not constructed as 100 people living in one space. They are households of 12, 14, 16 people. It's much, much more appropriate to care for people in those environments.
Okay. Well, Daniel, I'm gonna come back to you certainly, and in a moment I'm just going to come to Eileen Chubb, who actually has probably more frontline experience and experience of frontline workers trying to deal with the reality of life in care homes. But there are a couple of people I'd like to bring in. Paula Hornby, I see, has got her hand up. Or is your blue digital hand, Paula?
Yes, no, my hand's up.
Hello, come to us. What's your view?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Just my background. I come from an HR background, and my husband needed 24-hour care for 12 years. So I employed a lot of carers. He was at home. He wasn't in a residential setting. So that's my background. What I'd say is the problem is much wider than COVID. All the money there's two separate budgets. For social care, that comes out of the councils. The NHS has their own funding. So because they're separate budgets and both people are trying to save money, it's a great temptation in social care to keep people in hospitals, because once they take them, they're spending the money. And so my husband spent a couple of months in hospital, and I used to walk around the ward, and half the people on his ward in his hospital, they were no longer ill, but they couldn't get them out of hospital because there was nowhere for them to go. Social care is actually cheaper than a hospital, but it's a different budget. So there's a structural issue. If you look at the COVID, it's Jewish care actually, I know some of their work, and they are fantastic. So you have got somebody who is very good in the sector. That won't be true of everybody, because 85% of homes are privately run. And
but do you think, but Paul, can I just ask you, because it seems, I mean, look, this is obviously a seriously complicated set of problems, interlocking problems. But the point that you make about us hospitalising social care needs is actually this structural one that has been exposed, hasn't it, by the C19 crisis, which is that we venerate the NHS and we don't pay much attention to the social care system. Is that not fair?
Yeah, I mean, most social care workers are on 0 hours contracts. They are on minimum wages. This sector that we're not talking about, the out of care homes, they are going from house to house, and the council will say you can have 15 minutes to wash that person in that house, or 30 minutes. And I can tell you that's not enough time to treat anybody with dignity and respect. And then they're left for 4 hours on their own in their home. And so there's a real problem if you're, okay, so for COVID, there's a real problem if you're on a 0 hours contract for you to decide, maybe I was in contact with somebody I shouldn't have been in. Should I stay at home? I feel fine. I don't pay my rent if I don't go to work. So, you're in a terrible situation of spreading this virus because these people don't have the luxury of staying at home. So there's all sorts of issues in terms of pay for this sector, the 0 hours, the contracts they're on, how people view the role, because they don't see them as nurses, they see them as merely carers. So and what they're expected to do, and how little dignity we give people who are sick.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing. It's so funny, when I was reading Ian's piece as it came in and I was thinking about it, I kept hearing this phrase in my head, which has been such a common one the last few years, about parity of esteem, which has actually been, of course, about physical versus mental health. And it was just really striking to me how much I kept on thinking about the lack of parity of esteem. Paula, thank you. I'm going to bring a couple more, then I'm going to come to Eileen. Ingrid Rossner, are you there? Is Ingrid there? We may not have Ingrid, in which case, oh yes, Ingrid, there you are. Hello. Ingrid, you started this off. Can I just say the reason, it's lovely to see you, by the way. Can I say the one thing that I was really struck, you started off just making this point about how we deal with death and the way in which society is or isn't comfortable talking or thinking about death. Can you just explain a bit about what you meant by that?
Well, I think that many people might be shocked or worried by me saying that so directly, but I think that it's a truth that we abject death, that we feel a great shame about the fact that we die, and we're terribly frightened in general. Obviously, not everyone, but I think that we are frightened of seeing dying happening. So there's a history to that. In the 19th century, we would have seen death at first hand a lot more than we do now. I did not see my first dead body until I saw my parents. I'd got a long way through my life before I'd seen it.
And do you think, so do you think, Ingrid, because I think there is a point, and to be honest with you, I've thought this at times, I've thought, look, there are people working in care homes under incredibly difficult circumstances, and then of course they're going to be high mortality rates for exactly the reason that, Ian and Daniel said at the beginning, you're very elderly people, a lot of them with comorbidities, with serious sicknesses. When a pandemic comes along, they're going to die. Is that part of your point, that we just struggle to accept that?
Well, so this is to personalize things on an anecdotal way, but I was lucky enough to spend my mother's last 6 months essentially beside her as her daughter while she was in a nursing home. So I had the privilege of being able to stay a daughter while she was cared for. And that was an experience that's completely changed my life, completely changed my outlook, because for the first time in my life, I understood the nature of care, what care really is.
And changed it for the better or worse?
I hope that it's changed me for the better, because it forced me to reevaluate time. It forced me to reevaluate activity, the nature of connection. There were all the structural, systemic problems that have been so well described, but to be in that environment was a profoundly transformative experience. Care homes are extraordinary places, absolutely extraordinary. It's like a living philosophy. But yes, I was able to witness what it's like to be a carer who becomes attached to people and then loses them in a regular way, and carers who perform very intimate functions and become emotionally invested in the people that they care for, who then have to lose those people and move on quickly. That is psychologically very distressing. Those carers have to make a very quick turnaround in terms of attachment and letting go again. So I know that I'm taking a much more psychological and philosophical approach to the problem of the care home than all the previous speakers. And I know that that's only part of the discussion, but that relational aspect of what it is to care seems to me to be fundamentally important. And on it, we then build the systemic and structural solutions.
Ingrid, thank you. And I can see, by the way, I'm not sure whether you can see, but I can see both Ian and Daniel nodding as you speak. I'm going to bring, if I might, Eileen Chubb in, because Eileen runs Compassion in Care, which is built precisely, if I understand it right, Eileen, for thinking about how to make sure exactly the people that Ingrid described are properly respected and valued. Can you tell us a little bit about A, what it is that you do, but B, also what your view is of what's happening in the sector, and particularly the way in which carers are valued or treated in society?
Firstly, I always say I am a Bupa 7 whistleblower, because even though the law says I should be ashamed to be a whistleblower, I'm proud of it. So that's the first thing. I founded this charity because there was no other charities out there that were not taking funding from the care industry, and you'd often find that they didn't speak out when there were major scandals. So we wrote that into our constitution. To date, we've helped over 8,000 whistleblowers and over 5,000 families who've lost loved ones because whistleblowers were ignored. So we see it from both sides. We see the heartbreak, and we see that, you know, what it's like to work on the front line. I think the problems are, we've got a new criteria since COVID in judging a good care provider. Did they put their staff and residents at risk when they took in patients from hospital? Or did they put their staff and residents first and really lock down? That's another interesting angle that's come up. What we see is cost cutting. And, you know, we're talking about means testing people that need care. What we need to start doing is means testing the companies that are asking for more and more money to see where their profits are and, you know, how much money they've actually got. And then you could direct the money to the right people that need help, the smaller companies, the people that need help. I actually believe that there should be more publicly owned social care, because I think what you need is not a industry, privatized industry, 100% privatized, because that is not healthy. What you need is both publicly owned homes and also private homes. And I think that those publicly owned homes, if there was homes built gradually in every corner of the country, these care providers, the bad guys, they wouldn't be so, people, oh, will you take people into your home? We're not just reliant on them, and that would drive up standards immediately. I mean, obviously, I know for a fact that the care industry is, we deal with also the Whistler, which I co-founded, which deals with whistleblowers from all other sectors. But the care industry is one of the worst industries for sacking whistleblowers or forcing them out of their jobs. And we see it daily.
Yeah, and Eileen, forgive me for interrupting, but can I ask you a specific thing? One of the things that's very hard to read, I think, as Ian said, you know, there are 440,000 residents in care homes. There are 15,000, I think, plus, you know, care homes. One of the things that's very unclear to people is whether or not the big profitable providers are the problem or the solution. Are the big profitable ones actually providing a higher quality of care and better outcomes for residents? And it's the sort of small ones that go unseen and unmonitored that are a problem? Or is it just not as clear as that?
But on the whole, in my view, and also because I've visited over 300 care homes undercover across the UK, so I've seen the worst and I've seen the best personally, I'd say that there are more major problems in the bigger companies. Their staff tend to be more demoralised and demotivated than in the smaller homes. Now, for example, I've been in 2 care homes on one street. One was heaven and one was hell. And the one that was heaven was rated the same as the one that was hell. And the one that was heaven was a bit cheaper. So there's no hard and fast rule. It's just this or this or this. It's a number of things. But I think there's one word that probably is so lacking in the care industry that there's no incentive to improve. And that word is accountability. When things go wrong and there's not accountability, the message goes round that it's okay. You'll be on the law. You can do what you like to whistleblowers. You can do what you like with the residents, and because no one's going to hold you to account. And alas, people being held to account in the care industry are far too rare. And that gives the good providers a bad name as well, because they're all tarred with the same brush. So what I'd like to see are the bad guys, you know, the bigger companies. I think that they should be reduced. And you're seeing care homes that are warehouses, and they're not homes at all. You know, so, you know, that's the other thing that we see all the time. But also you see staff that go above and beyond the call of duty. I walked into one Southern Cross care home, and I've been in over 60 Southern Cross care homes. Southern Cross management got out with millions.
Right.
So, you know, that was driven into the ground. And some of those management went on to open up other companies and buy up the cheap Southern Cross care homes that they ran into the ground. So there's no accountability, and there's no reason to stop the worst people. I mean, Harold Shipman could buy a care home tomorrow. Believe me, he'd be registered as it.
Let me forgive me for interrupting again, but I don't know whether Paul Cottrell is still on the line, but Paul Cottrell made a really good point about, it seemed to me, there you are. Hello, Paul. Hello. You raised this point in the chat. I'd love to just pick up on it, which is about oversight, the Care Quality Commission. If you read Ian's piece, you'll see the sort of extraordinary fact of just how few homes are actually monitored and the CQC actually provides a rating for. What's your view on this? Just to pick up on Eileen's point about accountability.
All right, cheers, James. I work in a care home, just so people know that, in a dementia unit, bit of a warehouse, I think, what do you call it? What I wrote on the chat, so I'm not incredibly articulate, bear with me, but what I wrote on the chat was that actually probably for most carers about 2 hours out of our 12-hour shift is taken up doing notes, scribbling bits on the 15-minute chart, the 2-hourly chart, the fluid chart, which is fair enough, the food chart, other bits of chart, this, that and the other, the day report, and they're all repetitions of each other. And the reason we're doing that, the reason we're not spending those 2 hours with people, making them laugh, and I really love that bit from Ian about, I think it's Sheila, get somebody to laugh, and that's where she gets the energy to go through the day. The reason we're not doing that is the management are use it as a bit of a stick to beat us with. You know, we've got to get our charts in the order by the end of the day. And I think behind that is a fear of the CQC. Whether or not they turn up very much, you know, they know that they might get inspected at some point, so everything has to be there. And they'd rather do that. So they'd rather beat us for 2 hours a day doing the charts and all that kind of stuff than face that. Shall I pause there and let you go on?
It's just a really interesting point, Paul, because that's the thing I don't understand. So you have carers complaining about the bureaucracy of oversight, and then you have a large number of people complaining about the lack of oversight. I don't know whether I don't know how to make sense of that. But is that what you're saying?
Can I just do a quick comparison from when I worked in an hospital, maybe 20 years back, care of the elderly, end of life stuff. In those days, it was hospitals, different setting, they're really different places. But what we'd have is the nursing care plan, okay? And if things changed on the nursing care plan, you'd know about it. But if it didn't change, you would say, ask for care at the end of the shift. And that for us was a perfectly accountable thing because we had the care plan, we were acting to it. And what that gave us the space to actually be with people who were dying.
Right.
I'm not quite sure of the managerial reasons why all this has come in. I mean, pushing forward, I think we are where we are. I think there are ways in which you can develop more local accountability, which don't depend so much on what you write every day, a more risk-based approach. And I've said in the chat, something like a sort of local trades council almost with people invited in, because actually what matters to care homes, whether they're a big chain or not, is local reputation. Or else you're not going to let your mum or dad go and die there, are you?
Well, I totally by that. I'm going to come back, if I might, to Ian in a minute on that, but I'd like to bring in Nick Hood, who spent a lot of time looking at the industry of this. Before I come to you though, Nick, if I might, there are a number of people who just got their hands up, and I'd love to hear from. Sally Young has put her hand up. Actually, I think I asked her to put her hand up, so I might as well make sure. There you are. Sally, do you work in this area?
No, but I have worked in this area for many years, and I've been involved with charities. I've run a small care home. I've been involved with advocacy, and I have a relative who has a learning disability. So interested from a number of different sort of angles, and I've been a commissioner. I think there's something about our behaviours and attitudes as a society, to going back to where Ian started and how you regard people. So whether it's pushing them into care homes, and there are some good ones and there are some very poor ones, I know from my parents' own experience. And it's how we see that, how we perceive it. And I don't think it's got to be just the state or just the private sector, but I also like to think about, if I can use the term third way, look at other countries, look at Scandinavia, look at some of the brilliant work charities are doing, look at cooperatives, look at intergenerational housing and intergenerational living. And I think part of the problem that we have is that we don't want to go into them. We don't go into them unless we have to go into them for obvious reasons. And therefore, we're not really that bothered about it. And I think there's a number of different things that could be done, which ironically could end up being cheaper, rather than your either residential care or your nursing care or you're in the community, which means your unpaid carer has to try and look after you. So I do think there's something about our attitudes and behaviours, and we're talking about nursing and residential care here, which is mainly, but not just, older people. And I think the point Ian made, I don't want to lose that point, because a high number of people who use these services are what we would define as working age adults.
Sally, thank you. Nick, can I bring you, and I'll come back to you, Ian, if I may, in a second. You'll have seen that, rather like a sort of Oscar winner, Ian mentions Nick in the midst of this piece, because Nick has done years and years of forensic work on understanding the structure of the industry. Nick, without getting us too much into the weeds, what's your view of the extent to which there is a structural problem, the extent to which this is a financial set of problems?
Well, I think there are a number of fundamental flaws in the way that the industry operates, and we've touched on the cross-subsidisation problem between local authority residents who are underpaid, or their operators are underpaid by up to £200 a week for looking after them, and the massive premium that some self-funders in leafy Hertfordshire, where I live, are obliged to pay to cover that. But If I can just take you to the numbers, and then we'll circle round and come back to the structural problems. I got involved in this in 2013. It was pretty much at the time an insolvency practitioner looking at an industry that looked interesting. I admit to that, and I was younger then. It wasn't a personal issue, and I have watched over 6-7 years now as the CQC and the government have sat back and watched the industry's overall position deteriorate. And what I wanted to get out there was to give everybody an understanding of exactly what the size of the hole is that we're in here.
Right.
The industry borrows £6.4 billion. If you're going to do something to put the finances right, and I accept that I'm not an expert on the care issues and the respect issues, just consider for a moment the big four care operators, the major chains, borrow an average of £2.3 million per care home. Just think about that. Just think about that. And over the years, for example, there are nearly 800 care home operators with negative balance sheets, technically insolvent. Sorry to talk numbers here.
And what does that mean, Nick? Just explain for me.
What it means is that their liabilities are greater than their assets. So, I'm an ex-insolvency practitioner. They are technically insolvent on one of the tests set by the Insolvency Act.
And that means they have no flexibility to increase pay for their carers.
Absolutely.
They're cash strapped, basically.
Yeah, and again, just think about the numbers. Those big four care operators pay £239 million a year in interest on their debts.
Altogether,
the four of them. Yeah. So they, and I can tell you, it's as near as, damn it, 10% of their revenues. Right. Not quite. So the first pound of every 10 that residents in those homes pay goes straight out the door to interest.
Right.
So I asked myself the question is, and this has got steadily worse over the years. I've been tracking it for 7 years, and the number of companies that are technically insolvent, the scale of the deficit. Again, those 800 care home operators that are in negative equity, if you like, have negative. Their net deficit, but between them is £1.6 billion now. When I first looked at this, it was 400 million. So the whole situation deteriorated. And the reason on the whole for this is these companies lose money. Or else it's outside.
And sorry, can I start with one thing? This is going to take an extremely a problem that I know people are impassioned by, and there's a risk that we turn it into a kind of study in private equity finance. But Nick, can I just understand something? One of the reasons why typically businesses take on debt is that they can inflate the value or increase the value of the overall business. I.e., they can borrow to buy homes, and the use of that debt increases the value of the overall business, which doesn't flow through to the carers or necessarily the residents, but it does to the owners. Is it the case that borrowing in this case has been used to increase the value of the businesses or to plug the operating hole in the business?
Yes, I mean, and to quote, I hate to single out any particular company, but of course the poster child for this is Four Seasons, which has changed hands, as Ian says in his article, several times. Every time it went from like a game of pass the parcel between private equity players, the debt went up and somebody took a profit, and the company went forward with the profit as its debt. Right. So basically, every time it changed hands, it got worse.
And Nick, can I ask you then on this, right? So we started the conversation with how do you fix this problem? In certain sectors, right, there are limits on the debt that companies can take on. Certainly in certain public service sectors, you're actually not allowed to inflate the asset using debt. Right? Do you think that one of the measures, I mean, what do you think are the measures that would fix this?
Well, I mean, there are some very simple, straightforward things that need to happen here. I mean, forgetting the obvious solution of nationalising the entire thing, or particularly the top end of the market. The first solution is to actually make these people that are carrying these debt burdens and running these giant homes come clean. When Ian and I were talking about the article that is the basis of this chat, I had to say to him, I'm giving you the numbers as far as I can see them. And let's take the example of one that you feature in the article, Ian, HC1.
Mm.
I couldn't reassure him that the numbers that I was giving him were correct, because above the one that I had numbers for, there were 9 Cayman Island companies in an escalating set going up to an ultimate parent company.
Right.
And I have no clue. The only thing I do know is that numbers that Ian talked about are not the right ones. We just don't have the full position. So, cut a long story short, for these operators to continue to have registration to run care homes in the UK, they should be required to bring their entire corporate and financing structure onshore.
Yeah.
No ifs or buts or, oh, I'm sorry, it's all because of historic deals, which is what people have trotted out to Ian as excuses for this. Bring it onshore, then we can see what is going on. And further, certainly if they're going to ask for government help, which is what some of them are doing, there should be no question of any dividend payments, any out the back door payments to related parties, which again, Ian highlighted in his article. We need openness. In America, there is actually a disclosure requirement in the care home industry that you cannot have these opaque structures. And damn right, that's how it should be.
Nick, thank you so much. I'm going to come back, if I can, Ian. Listening to this, I noticed that sort of Nick mentioned in passing the idea of nationalisation, but then walked away from that and moved towards just much greater transparency. Do you think that's enough? Because listening to Paul Cottrell, I'm sort of struck by the fact there is also a big practical regulatory oversight problem.
Well, I want to come to the regulation, because everyone always thinks it's about regulation. Actually, what we've seen quite often, I've seen with the work I've done with youth in autism and learning disability, mental health issues, the CQC quite often has given a very good rating to an institution which then turns out to be physically abusing, torturing staff. It gave very good ratings to some of the worst offenders, people who were keeping children in solitary confinement and feeding them through hatches on the floor in a room with no bedding. They got very good ratings from the CQC. CQC has a massive job. It's totally overloaded. And if you visit a place for 2 days every 2 years, that's not a good way to check. And on top of that, I don't know whether you can see this, but this is a list of protocols that a care home has to have. There's about 150 of them. And for a protocol, that means you've got to sit down, you've got to work out what your policy is, and you've got to maybe get all your senior staff together and then keep it on file, and then it can be checked at any time. Now, within that, there are very sensible things, of course, like how do you handle if a resident goes missing, or what do you do in the event of someone's death? But there's also, you have to have officially, according to tick the boxes for the CQC, you need to have your policy on pets, on e-cigarettes, on opening Christmas presents. There's a whole range of them, which are just ludicrous. Ultimately, I come back to the idea that in the same way as if you have good people who are treated like human beings, you don't get abuse in a mental health institution. It's about humanity. Ultimately, the CQC is never going to be able to check every dentist surgery in the country, every care home, every hospital, every GP surgery. It's just too big a job. You cannot totally rely on regulation. You need a regulation, you need inspections, but ultimately you've got to have a system where the staff and the people using the services are empowered. So the staff are listened to. It's, Eileen's absolutely right about the whistleblower. A lot of these places don't allow unions and actively stop unions organising. You've got to have staff empowered. You've got to have users empowered. And that's one part of it. And Nick is also right. The state is a very powerful body. We forget that, you probably know, James, what is it? 45% of GDP is spent by the state. Fantastically powerful. if the state did what Denmark has just said in the terms of bailout and said, we're not going to give any money to any company which is hidden away its tax haven. This taxpayers' money, and therefore if you're receiving taxes, you should have your body, your institution, your company should be based in the UK and paying taxes and transparent so we can see who's getting the money. It's a very simple thing the state could do quite easily, and it would go a long way. It wouldn't solve the problems, but it would help rectify them.
Well, Ian, that's really helpful, and I think that one of the things that surely is the inescapable fact of this pandemic is there's no such thing as offshore. No one lives offshore. We all live where we live, and the consequence of that, it seems to me in policy terms, are going to be inescapable. I'm going to bring a couple of people who've got their hands up. One is Dom Tyler, and I want to come back to Eileen Chubb in a minute. Dom, I don't know whether or not, there you are. Yes, what do you want to say?
So I guess I'm partly picking up on what Nick said. Obviously, we're talking a lot about how these companies are funded, and I wouldn't say that the corporate structures that they're using are in any way justifiable. But if private equity firms like these are the only ones who are willing to take on care home companies, and other investors are not touching them, does that not suggest that the companies themselves are not capable of providing a good return on investment generally? So we talked about self-funders sort of being overcharged and cross-subsidising sort of publicly funded residents. If you just took those relatively high fees that those self-funders are paying, could a brand new business run a care home sustainably on that amount of money? Right. Could cheap government loans to set up a care home? Obviously, there's a big investment in actually building the home and getting it set up, but is it possible to run a care home sustainably with the current level of fees, or is the whole system unable to support itself financially? There's a key question. I'm going to come back in a moment. I'm going to come back to you, Daniel, in a moment, but I want to bring in Wade Newmark, partly because he said something in the chat which seemed really smart and I didn't understand what it meant. So Wade, what's the issue here about the way in which the care homes operate financially?
Well, going back to 2001 with Westminster Healthcare, fairly early on, there was a perceived arbitrage between the value of the properties that were owned by care home businesses versus, and the amount that you could raise against those properties versus the amount that you could raise against the businesses. So fundamentally, the businesses then were having to pay, and I'm talking about total debt service, so that's interest plus principal repayments. In the early 2000s, businesses were having to pay between 7 and 8% for their money, and the property companies were having to pay 4 to 5%. So what many people did, and HC1, by the way, is the fourth iteration of Westminster Healthcare, and that is a saga of asset stripping and poor management is an understatement, whereby what the underlying company did was it took all of its properties, sold them into a special purpose company. That special purpose company was sold to friends and family. It in turn was leveraged so that it made a substantial return as a property company, and the burden of those property company rents and debt service were then passed straight back to the original operating company, i.e. Westminster Healthcare. The net result of this is that Westminster Healthcare went from a viable, well-run business which made a reasonable profit, which in turn would be reinvested to doing refurbishments, improving training, and all the other important things that those who run care homes need to do. And suddenly there was another mouth to feed, to put it bluntly, yeah. And in the form of a landlord. And that is where Four Seasons and also Southern Cross ended up. And that's the financial engineering pickle that caused this nearly 2 decades ago, by the way. If I can also answer the previous speaker, Dom's question about sustainability. you cannot make money running a care home with local authority payments solely, and I'm talking about residential care. I've done a great deal of work on this. I visited, in the past 4 years, I visited 110 different care homes, and I've done desktop reviews of over 300. I run 3 myself, of 3 very different types. Fundamentally, we lose with local authority residential health care in the region of 30 to 50 pounds per resident per week. And believe me, I run a very tight ship. With that home, I haven't taken a single dividend out of that home in the 4 years that I've owned it. And by the way, that is not a highly leveraged care home. We have 65% LTV for the benefit of Nick Hood to understand leverage. So I think there is a fundamental structural issue. We have an industry, by the way, where our basic or living wage has gone up by 46% since the introduction of the minimum wage in the past decade, and the local authority increases have been approximately half of that. So there's an economic squeeze from which we cannot get out from under, and there's, I could go on for hours about this, but
I'm going to cut. It's really, really helpful to hear it so clearly. But we've got a couple of minutes left, and I'm just literally going to hear from Eileen, who I know has a point to make, and Daniel, I hope, who has going to figure out a way of leaving us with something uplifting. Eileen, if you will, briefly.
Yes, I'm familiar with Westminster Healthcare, and they were previously called Cavendish. So I'm very well aware that the same individuals have moved through this industry with the same dodgy tactics for 2 decades or more. And the result of that has been poor care. Now, public money has been spent on bad care, regardless. What we need to start doing is looking at these companies that are open for business and making sure that they're transparent and they're accountable. But most of all, we need to protect whistleblowers. We have a campaign for Edna's Law, which puts the person in the care home at the heart of the legal process of whistleblowing. And we believe that's the only way, because if their voices are not heard, then, it doesn't matter how much you pay for care. I mean, at the end of the day, when things go wrong, that's, a good care home, it's great. It's how they respond to concerns. A bad care home, they bury them and anyone who's raising those concerns. And that's always going to be at the heart of this. It has to be transparent. We have to empower the staff in those homes. And most of all, the victims of abuse. That abuse needs to be acted on, because when it's not acted on, it goes on and on and on. And then you get 3 or 4 more whistleblowers coming down the line about the same care home 3 or 4 years later. And that is totally unacceptable.
Eileen, thank you. I'm sorry to rush you, but I wanted to give Daniel one final thought. Daniel, is there a way that we could actually come out of this with something structurally better?
Sorry, James, just to unmute myself. I'm not sure there is in the short term. I was just going to illustrate a point that Wade just made, which is that on the 1st of April this year, the government increased the national minimum wage by 6.2%, something providers like us are wholly in favour of because we value our people enormously. But the increase in the corresponding fees from local authorities for directly providing care in residential care is often in the region of 1 to 2%. And that gap has continued to widen over many years. Like, I think to answer your question, James, I think we've got a bit of a burning platform here. We haven't talked about the fact that the next 20 years is going to see the need increase in a really significant way, because the baby boomer generation is going to reach that age of need. So my hope is that the momentum that's been created by what's happened over COVID and the light that's been shone on the sector will provide an opportunity for all of us, all the stakeholders who are engaged in this process, to find the solutions, because we desperately need to, for the sake of ourselves and our parents and our grandparents.
Okay, Daniel, thank you. I'm going to wind up, because we're trying to make sure that we deal with a subject that couldn't possibly be contained in an hour. But I do want to say that I really appreciate the point that one of our Tortoise members, Mehdi, made in the chat, which is we need to do more on this subject. We can't do it justice in an hour. And so we will come back to it. Through the course of this week, we have a series of pieces on it. My colleague Basha Cummins is the editor on it. She's edited a piece tomorrow on how Spain is dealing with it, and actually the legal interventions in Spain, how lawyers are getting involved to try and address some of the problems in care homes in Spain, where again they've got the examples of private equity firms who've invested in this sector. Typically, I think it ends with a better informed point of view. I have to say, given that I was starting at a low base, I have the advantage that I was better informed by everyone. But I do come away actually with one overriding and simple thought, which just comes from Eileen, which is this point about accountability, and the fact that you're operating a public service in an area where there is such limited accountability is obviously unsustainable. And at the heart of this problem. And I think that, Nick Hood's very simple point, which is, we're reporting on something that we can't possibly understand because it is so obscured by offshore arrangements. There is obviously an issue there about tax, but there's simply an issue there about transparency and accountability. I do think that there is a big financial issue here, which is the point that Wade Newmark really made in a way that sort of scales lift from your eyes. You suddenly realize that these are, to some extent, real estate plays masquerading as care operators. And we have to think, if they're public services, what's the extent to which there is the capacity for financial engineering, and particularly for non-care spending in this sector, i.e. if 10% is going on debt and more on fees, etc., how much is actually going to the residents? So it seems to me as though there is accountability around the public service requirements. And then finally, I just sort of come back to the point that Ingrid made that was, I suppose, the starting point from Ian, which is, what kind of society are we? How do we think about people who care and the people who are cared for, and do we keep on looking away? It feels to me as though this has been a wake-up call for our society, and not just ours, many others, where we have a view around doctors and nurses, but not the same one around carers, and that potentially is the motivator to change so much of this and bring accountability into the system, not least because it starts with us. There has been clearly a political failure for not just a decade, for many years longer than that. But perhaps one of the things that can change out of this particular crisis is a decision to address the accountability in social care. We will keep looking at it. I think that this is the beginning for us of a long and open file in the social care system. Please do keep contributing to it, and please do keep letting us know ways in which your experience, your expertise can better inform our journalism. It's certainly done that tonight. A big and heartfelt thank you to Daniel, to Eileen, to Nick, and to Ian for all the work that you've done to really help us understand this story. But to all of you who joined us this evening, thank you very much. Have a very good evening. We can't give you all, or each of us, a round of applause, but we can at least wave a smile and wish you all a very good evening. Thank you very much, everyone.